December 19, 1944. In a cold, stone-walled barracks in Verdun, France, senior Allied commanders gathered under the weight of alarming reports from the Ardennes. 2 days earlier, German forces had launched a massive surprise offensive through the forested hills of Belgium and Luxembourg, shattering thinly held American lines and driving a deep bulge into the Allied front. The offensive, ordered by Adolf Hitler, aimed to split British and American forces, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The scale and speed of the attack stunned Allied leadership. Communications were disrupted, units were overrun, and road networks clogged with retreating troops and refugees. At Verdun, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a stark reality. The German gamble had achieved strategic surprise. The question was no longer whether the enemy could be stopped, but how quickly Allied commanders could regain cohesion under pressure. Among those present at Verdun was Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the U.S. Third Army. His forces were positioned to the south, engaged in heavy fighting along the Saar and in Lorraine. The German breakthrough threatened to cut off key supply routes and isolate entire formations. Eisenhower needed immediate options. During the conference, Patton was asked how quickly he could pivot his army north to relieve the embattled town of Bastogne, where elements of the 101st Airborne Division and other units were encircled. Patton's response, proposing a turn of multiple divisions within 48 to 72 hours, was audacious. The logistical and operational challenges were immense. Winter weather, limited road capacity, fuel shortages, and ongoing combat operations to the south. Yet the urgency of the situation demanded decisive action. If you value detailed historical analysis like this, subscribe to support this channel and ensure continued exploration of pivotal moments that shaped the Second World War. The German operation, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, had been conceived as a high-risk counteroffensive. German planners sought to exploit what they perceived as Allied complacency in the Ardennes sector, traditionally considered unsuitable for large-scale mechanized operations in winter. Under the command of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Walther Model, German forces concentrated armored and infantry divisions for a surprise assault. The offensive began on December 16 with a heavy artillery barrage, followed by rapid armored thrusts that pierced inexperienced American units. Poor weather grounded Allied air power, depriving defenders of one of their most significant advantages. Within days, German spearheads advanced westward, capturing key road junctions and threatening to isolate forward units. At Bastogne, the convergence of several major roads made the town strategically vital. American commanders recognized that its loss would facilitate further German exploitation. The 101st Airborne Division, under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, was rushed to reinforce the area. However, German encirclement soon isolated the town, cutting supply lines and subjecting defenders to artillery bombardment. The stand at Bastogne became symbolic of resistance under extreme conditions, yet at the moment of encirclement, the outcome was uncertain. Ammunition was limited, medical supplies scarce, and winter temperatures severe. Patton's proposed maneuver required an extraordinary reorientation of his army. Third Army had been advancing eastward. Now it would have to disengage, pivot north, and attack into the southern flank of the German Bulge. This demanded not only operational agility but meticulous staff work. Patton's chief of staff, Major General Hugh Gaffey, an operations officer, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, coordinated movement orders with precision. Units were reassigned, traffic control measures established, and supply priorities recalculated. The ability to execute such a maneuver rested on months of training, discipline, and command cohesion. Weather remained a critical variable. Snow and ice reduced mobility, while overcast skies limited reconnaissance and air support. The German plan had relied heavily on maintaining poor weather to shield movement from Allied aircraft. As Patton's forces moved north, they faced treacherous road conditions and congestion. Military police directed columns through narrow routes, attempting to prevent gridlock. The sheer scale of the movement, hundreds of thousands of men and vehicles, illustrated the complexity of modern mechanized warfare. On December 22, Patton's leading elements attacked toward Bastogne. The initial objective was to break through German lines south of the town and establish a corridor. Resistance proved determined. German units, including elements of the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, defended key positions with anti-tank guns and fortified infantry. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles. The relief of Bastogne depended on sustained pressure and coordination among infantry, armor, and artillery. Artillery played a decisive role in the counteroffensive. American doctrine emphasized massed firepower, and Third Army's artillery units delivered concentrated barrages to suppress German defenses. The coordination of fire missions under winter conditions required effective communication and logistical support. Ammunition had to be transported over icy roads, and guns repositioned in snow-covered terrain. The cumulative effect of sustained bombardment eroded German capacity to hold forward positions. Air power re-emerged as weather conditions improved after December 23. Allied aircraft targeted German supply columns and armored formations, compounding logistical strain on the offensive. The Luftwaffe, weakened by years of attrition, could not match Allied air superiority. This shift in conditions altered the operational balance. German units, already extended, now faced increasing isolation. On December 26, elements of the 4th Armored Division reached Bastogne, establishing a tenuous link with the defenders. The corridor was narrow and vulnerable, but it signaled a turning point. The relief did not immediately end fighting. German forces continued attempts to sever the connection, yet the psychological and operational impact was profound. The German timetable had been disrupted, and momentum shifted. The broader Allied response involved coordinated counterattacks from north and south. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery assumed temporary command of forces north of the Bulge, while American commanders consolidated efforts in the south. The necessity of unified command under crisis tested coalition dynamics. Differences in communication styles and operational philosophy required careful management by Eisenhower to prevent friction from undermining effectiveness. German forces faced mounting challenges. Fuel shortages constrained armored maneuver, and casualties reduced combat effectiveness. The initial element of surprise could not compensate indefinitely for material disadvantages. As January 1945 progressed, Allied counteroffensives gradually reduced the Bulge. Bitter fighting in forests and villages exacted heavy losses on both sides. The winter campaign underscored the human cost of strategic decisions made under pressure. Patton's race through the Ardennes highlighted the interplay between preparation and improvisation. His army's rapid pivot was not solely a product of personal resolve, but of institutional capability. Training, logistical planning, and staff coordination enabled execution. At the same time, risk remained high. Had road congestion paralyzed movement? Had German resistance been more concentrated? Or had weather continued to ground air support? The relief of Bastogne might have been delayed with severe consequences. The Ardennes campaign represented Germany's final major offensive in the West. By expending reserves in a desperate gamble, German leadership weakened its capacity to resist subsequent Allied advances into the Reich. For the Allies, the battle reinforced lessons about vigilance and the danger of underestimating a cornered adversary. Intelligence assessments prior to the offensive had not fully anticipated the scale of German capability to concentrate forces in the Ardennes. The shock of the breakthrough prompted reassessment of defensive dispositions and command readiness. In the months following the battle, Allied forces resumed their advance toward the Rhine. The resilience demonstrated during the Ardennes crisis contributed to renewed confidence, yet the memory of vulnerability persisted. Commanders understood that even late in the war, miscalculation could yield costly setbacks. The race to Bastogne became emblematic of responsiveness under pressure, but it also illustrated how narrow the margin for failure could be in large-scale operations. As Third Army pushed eastward after the Bulge was reduced, it encountered fortified German positions along the Siegfried Line. The winter terrain, coupled with determined defense, slowed progress. Nonetheless, the initiative had irrevocably shifted. The German offensive had failed to achieve its objectives, and Allied forces retained cohesion. The mission that had nearly faltered under the weight of surprise, and whether ultimately demonstrated the capacity of Allied command structures to adapt under extreme strain. Within the broader narrative of the Second World War, the Ardennes campaign exemplifies the convergence of strategic ambition, operational risk, and human endurance. Decisions made in conference rooms reverberated across frozen forests and embattled towns. The relief of Bastogne was not inevitable. It was contingent on coordination, timing, and resilience. As Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine in early 1945, the experience of December 1944 remained a stark reminder that even in the war's closing chapters, outcomes depended on the ability to respond decisively when uncertainty threatened to overwhelm design. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 marked the transition from desperate defensive recovery to sustained offensive penetration into the German heartland. For commanders who had faced the shock of the Ardennes only weeks earlier, the contrast was striking. Allied forces now possessed overwhelming material superiority, secure air dominance, and improved intelligence coordination. Yet the lessons of December 1944 lingered in operational planning. Vigilance remained essential. German resistance, though increasingly fragmented, could still impose localized costs. In this environment, Third Army under George S. Patton Jr. advanced rapidly once river crossings were secured, exploiting breaches and pushing deep into central Germany. The tempo reflected both accumulated experience and the recognition that speed could dislocate remaining enemy cohesion before defensive lines solidified. One of the defining operational moments of this phase occurred at Oppenheim, where Third Army executed a crossing of the Rhine ahead of schedule. The decision demonstrated initiative within the framework established by Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force under Dwight D. Eisenhower. While the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen by First Army had already provided a dramatic foothold across the river, Patton's crossing underscored the competitive yet coordinated nature of Allied advances. Engineers worked under fire to establish pontoon bridges, while artillery suppressed German positions along the eastern bank. The operation revealed how logistical preparation and command flexibility combined to transform opportunity into momentum. As Third Army advanced through Hesse and Thuringia, it encountered increasingly disorganized German units. Many formations were under strength, composed of a mixture of veteran soldiers, Volkssturm militia, and remnants of shattered divisions. Nevertheless, pockets of resistance persisted. Urban centers such as Frankfurt and Kassel required careful clearance to minimize casualties and secure supply lines. The pattern of advance illustrated a recurring theme of late-war operations. Rapid movement interspersed with sudden, intense engagements that reflected both desperation and ideological rigidity among some defenders. The liberation of prisoner-of-war camps and concentration camps during this advance confronted American forces with evidence of systematic brutality. Though Third Army was not the first to encounter such sites, its troops participated in the liberation of camps including Oehrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald. The discovery of emaciated prisoners and mass graves had a profound psychological impact on soldiers and commanders alike. Eisenhower himself visited liberated camps to ensure that documentation would withstand scrutiny and denial. The exposure of these crimes reinforced the moral dimension of Allied objectives and intensified resolve to dismantle the Nazi regime completely. Strategically, the collapse of organized German resistance accelerated in April 1945. Soviet forces advanced from the east, while Anglo-American armies converged from the west. Coordination among allies required diplomatic sensitivity as well as military precision. The agreed demarcation lines reflected prior conferences and anticipated post-war occupation zones. For commanders in the field, however, immediate priorities centered on securing surrendering units, preventing unnecessary destruction, and maintaining order amid administrative breakdown. The surrender of German forces in Italy on May 2 and the unconditional surrender signed on May 7 at Reims signaled the formal end of hostilities in Europe. The document, signed by representatives of the German High Command and accepted by Allied officials including General Walter Bedell Smith on behalf of Eisenhower, confirmed the military defeat of the Third Reich. Yet for field commanders like Patton, the transition from combat to occupation introduced new uncertainties. The structures designed for offensive warfare required adaptation to governance, demobilization, and stabilization tasks. Third Army's occupation responsibilities included overseeing disarmament, processing prisoners of war, and implementing denazification policies. These tasks demanded administrative discipline distinct from battlefield maneuver. Patton's public remarks during this period, sometimes perceived as dismissive of political screening processes, drew scrutiny from superiors and civilian authorities. The friction highlighted the broader challenge facing Allied leadership, reconciling military pragmatism with political imperatives in shaping post-war Germany. At the same time, the redeployment of American forces toward the Pacific Theater was under consideration. Prior to Germany's surrender, planning had begun for potential involvement in operations against Japan. The abrupt conclusion of the European War shifted strategic calculations. While Patton expressed interest in future commands, his role became increasingly constrained by the evolving political context. The demands of coalition diplomacy and occupation policy limited the autonomy that operational command had previously afforded. Reflecting on the Ardennes campaign within this broader arc reveals how close the Allied position had come to destabilization in December 1944. The German offensive, though ultimately unsuccessful, exposed vulnerabilities in intelligence assessment and defensive allocation. The ability of Third Army to pivot and relieve Bastogne was a product not only of individual determination, but of institutional resilience. Staff coordination, logistical foresight, and the cumulative experience of years of combat enabled adaptation under pressure. The Ardennes also underscored the significance of weather and terrain in shaping operational possibilities. Dense forests, limited road networks, and winter conditions magnified both opportunity and risk. German planners had counted on these factors to offset Allied advantages in air power and mobility. When weather improved, the balance shifted decisively. The interplay between environmental variables and strategic ambition illustrates the contingent nature of military outcomes. Coalition dynamics during the crisis further illuminate the complexity of Allied command. Temporary reassignment of sectors to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery generated political sensitivities, particularly within American ranks. Eisenhower's decision aimed at unity of effort, yet communication challenges fueled post-war debates over credit and interpretation. The episode demonstrates how wartime decisions, made under intense time pressure, can carry enduring implications for historical memory. For soldiers on the ground, the race through the Ardennes translated strategic calculation into lived experience. Infantry units endured freezing temperatures, artillery barrages, and uncertain supply. Medical services operated under strain, evacuating wounded across icy roads. Engineers cleared mines and repaired bridges amid ongoing combat. The cumulative effort reflected the interdependence of combat arms and support services in sustaining operational momentum. German forces, too, confronted escalating pressures. Fuel shortages constrained maneuver, Allied air attacks disrupted supply routes, and casualty rates eroded combat effectiveness. The decision to launch the Ardennes offensive represented a calculated risk by Hitler, premised on fracturing Allied cohesion. When initial gains failed to achieve strategic objectives, German capacity to recover diminished rapidly. The offensive expended reserves that might otherwise have prolonged resistance along the Rhine. In analyzing the mission that nearly failed, historians emphasize contingency rather than inevitability. Had Bastogne fallen quickly, had Allied command cohesion fractured, or had weather conditions persisted in grounding aircraft, the operational landscape might have shifted dramatically. The resilience demonstrated by Third Army and other Allied formations was therefore not predetermined. It emerged from preparation, adaptation, and sustained logistical capacity. The closing phase of the European War did not erase the memory of December 1944. Instead, it reinforced awareness that even overwhelming superiority could be challenged by surprise and concentration. Commanders carried these lessons into occupation duties, and for some, into post-war military doctrine. The integration of intelligence analysis, rapid maneuver planning, and inter-allied coordination became foundational principles in subsequent strategic thinking. As Europe moved from devastation toward reconstruction, the narrative of the Ardennes remained a testament to the volatility of war's final months. The forests of Belgium and Luxembourg bore scars of armored clashes and artillery fire. Cemeteries expanded with the names of those who had fought in freezing conditions to halt a desperate offensive. The broader Allied advance into Germany, culminating in surrender, cannot be fully understood without recognizing how precarious the situation had appeared only weeks before. Within this continuum, Patton's race through the Ardennes stands as both operational achievement and illustration of risk. It reveals the extent to which modern warfare depends on coordination across multiple domains: logistics, intelligence, air power, and morale. It also underscores how leadership decisions, shaped by urgency and uncertainty, reverberate through campaigns and into historical interpretation.